Hello and welcome to What's Driving Electric Vehicles with Blytheweigh. There's lots of excitement at the moment about electric vehicles, how they're going to develop, and hardly a week seems to go by without there's news from a major motor manufacturer like Ford or Chrysler about their developments in electric cars and electric vehicles. In 4 or 5 years' time, we're all going to have a much better choice of what kind of car we're going to be driving. But an issue seems to be, how will the batteries be made? How will they be constituted? What's going to be the significance for nickel, cobalt, lithium and a host of other metals and minerals? We're going to be looking at these issues and how investors can best decide which commodities to follow and where to place their money in this monthly series. Today we are joined in the studio by Mike Oxley, Chief Executive of Brazilian Nickel, and Jeremy Rathall, Founder and Chief Executive of Cornish Lithium. But before we get into the detail of lithium or nickel, we're also joined by Rebecca Gordon of the CRU consultancy, who's going to give us a quick overview of where Rebecca sees the industry and the market. So Rebecca, what's the context for you, please?
So within CRU Consulting, we track the commodity markets. That's the reason that the business was founded. And it became very clear to us that the revolution that's occurring in electric vehicles would change the demand for many of the commodities we look at. And it's not a small change. The mobile phone revolution occurred, smartphones, tablets. It had an impact on the commodity markets, particularly cobalt, but an electric car is a very big item.
Sure.
A change to a single electric car or multiple electric cars stretches the commodity markets much further. And it's also very interesting that it's not driven so much by technological advancement not purely by technological advancement as was smartphones. Right. Consumers demanded the technology. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it's driven also very strongly by policy. So we're seeing policy announcements coming out of particularly China, but also India and other cities as well as countries, that really puts pressure on auto manufacturers and consumers to move towards a green and ecological solution to their transport. And that can be achieved in a number of ways, actually. It can be achieved through car sharing. It can be achieved through the use of buses, trams and trains. But people do like their own transport. So we're seeing this revolution in people buying more ecological cars. And at the moment, the most ecological solution is thought to be the electric vehicle. And that pushes very heavily, particularly on the energy storage commodities. They're normally smaller volumes in the market compared to, let's say, steel or coal, and in some cases less able to respond. So if we think about the cobalt market, it's very much byproduct produced. There's only a single primary mine, and the ability of that market to respond to this big change means that people get concerned about where that material is going to come from in the longer term. And you see quite quickly the market, the mother of invention really, you get the recycling market coming in, you get people looking at alternative supply, byproducts of other commodities in other countries. But the market really does have to think more carefully this time in terms of those commodities, about where they will come from.
You know, I know that, so you mentioned China earlier on, and there's been a lot of stuff written about the Chinese going around the world securing their access to things like lithium. Now, you're bringing Jeremy Rathall from Cornish Lithium. I mean, Jeremy, is that an issue for your industry? Is it an issue for the UK? I mean, where do you position Cornish Lithium in all of that?
Well, I think that there's two issues: the Cornish Lithium side and also the national security. As the US woke up early or late last year and realised that 20 of the 23 critical metals are now controlled by China, and Donald Trump suddenly realised that, and now that's a very big theme, and exploring in the US. It's the same thing in the UK, in my view, that we are basically at the whim of China now for some of the metals that we desperately need for electric car revolution. So in terms of Cornish Lithium, we believe we've identified a potentially large source of lithium in Cornwall. It was first recognised in 1864, so nothing new, but we believe that could help ameliorate a potential crisis of critical metals such as lithium and nickel and other things.
And so, Mike, a nice segue there into nickel. Are we seeing the same issues with access to the commodity that countries will need? Where does nickel sit in all of this?
The interesting thing about nickel, I think, is that historically the nickel industry has been set up to provide stainless steel, which is still 60% of the demand for nickel. And so we have the production processes produce a lot of ferronickel, and all the recent projects have been alloying nickel with iron. Now, in terms of electric vehicles and the cathodes that go in there, which are nickel, cobalt, manganese, or aluminium, then that nickel is of no use. And one of the problems has been that new nickel projects are quite rare. And I don't think people have necessarily realised that the demand on the electric vehicle side is really just then going to have to come from an expansion of 30 to 40% of the nickel industry.
30 to 40% new nickel to be discovered and exploited.
Well, of the current supply, but then, yes, you could be looking at doubling that within the next 8 or 10 years because of the demand from electric vehicles. And that makes it, rather interesting for a company like ourselves because we can supply that side of things. And we also supply cobalt, of course.
Right.
I know that CRU look at cobalt quite extensively. But one of the interesting things that we're seeing in the batteries is that people are substituting nickel for the cobalt because there's been a realization that there's a shortage of cobalt. A lot of it, as you mentioned, comes from places where the security of supply is an issue. And of course, some consumers in cobalt are worried about supply from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there is the potential for child labour involved in that production.
Right.
So by substituting nickel, you can start managing some of those issues, but it's not as if the nickel industry can respond very quickly to these increased levels of supply. I mean, it takes, 10 years to get a new mine going?
Yeah,
so, and if we're looking at such a large increase over the next 8 years, there's a potential crunch point, I think, coming in many commodities, not just nickel, where the supply response is just simply limited by the time it takes for an industry to respond.
I think some of the issues going to be facing investors. You were talking about nickel and cobalt being substituted in the battery. When we get to the point in 4 or 5 years' time where we are having access as consumers to driving our electric car, do we know what's actually going to be in the battery? So investors sitting there now, should they be looking at cobalt or nickel or lithium? Or, Rebecca, has it been standardised yet? Is there a standard makeup of the battery?
No, definitely not. There are 3 main sort of technology families that I think we could talk about. Lithium iron phosphate, which is preferred in the Chinese market. It offers a fairly low-cost solution. It's not got the energy density, but it works for buses. It's adequate
Right.
for short-range vehicles.
Yep.
And then we have the competition between the nickel, cobalt, manganese, and lithium technology, and the nickel, cobalt, aluminium with lithium technology. And they're the patents and the control of those are from 2 different countries, but those are the 2 that are going into batteries. Within the nickel, cobalt, manganese family, exactly as was mentioned, you can exchange between those commodities. So we've seen a move from very high or balanced nickel, cobalt, manganese towards more and more nickel. And it gives you increased performance in the battery, slightly at the expense of stability. But it also does drive down the cost. So there's a lot of research going on that would push that family towards higher nickel, lower cobalt.
So, when do we see this being standardised, finalised? How far away from that are we?
Well, there could be new families that come in. I think what we're looking at today are not solutions that will give you both the power you want and the cost that people really need in the long term. So I think we still need to be looking at what's happening in the labs. It could be that it's lithium air, it could be aluminium air, it could be zinc air, it could be, but likely to be something with a lower material cost, but an increased complexity within the electrochemistry to make it work.
Sure.
But I don't think today's big families are necessarily the end point.
Okay, but in terms of winners and losers, we have a lithium miner, we have a nickel miner.
Yeah.
Investors today, are we fairly confident that both these elements, I mean, Jeremy, you're fairly confident you're going to have lithium in batteries in 4 or 5 years' time?
Well, I think there's two things. It's lithium this or lithium this or lithium this. It's all lithium technologies at the moment. I think we're some way off if we see another metal competing with lithium, because lithium is the lightest metal,
Yes.
and one of the most chemically reactive, so that mitigates in its favour. So the debate is more around what you put with lithium in your battery, rather than whether you're going to have.
So your lithium's a winner?
I think so.
Especially as we're walking down the aisle with your lithium.
And I think that the auto industry at the moment is very much lithium ion or lithium all that investment's going into lithium ion, so it's going to be pretty hard to turn that ship around.
Sure.
It's going to be lithium ion with nickel, cobalt, everything else.
Mike, nickel, where's nickel going to be in all of this?
Well, I think for the same reasons, really, the nickel and cobalt will be very much required by the electric vehicle market, because the capacity for those batteries is already being built. So they've committed to a particular technology that will then need to fill, the demand of those electric vehicles, and it's going to have to be suited to the infrastructure that will be built. I believe, from talking to some of our potential customers, they need 5 to 7 years to decide on a factory, build it, and get it operational. And because the momentum is there, while I think a lot of these new ideas and technologies may well eventually come, they've again got quite a long lead time before we'll see them affecting what's happening. And there will always, I think, be choice. People will look at different kinds of electric vehicles. They may want power, they may want faster response. There'll be different kinds of batteries that you can use for those situations. I mean, the iron phosphate we know is good for buses and regular charging, but it doesn't make a sports car.
Okay. But there we have it. I suppose if we'd been sitting here a few years ago, nickel miners wouldn't be as excited as they are today about the future. Lithium miners wouldn't be as excited as they are today about the future. Electric vehicles, electric cars are going to drive that demand and hopefully drive share prices. So that's it today from What's Driving Electric Vehicles. Tune in, plug in, stay charged. Thank you.